Sometimes, life takes unexpected turns. A single moment, a simple decision, can change everything forever. A police officer, haunted by his broken family and his daughter's worsening illness, tries to escape his pain for just one night. But fate has other plans. A mysterious couple lost in the woods, a strange pendant with an address, and a McDonald's order that comes with something far more dangerous than just a meal. What was supposed to be a simple break from reality turns into a desperate race against time. The past he thought he had left behind is catching up, and the truth is far more terrifying than he could ever imagine. Stay with us until the very end, and don't forget to subscribe and let us know where you're watching from. The rain poured down heavily, drumming against the leaves like a relentless heartbeat. Officer Daniel Carter gripped the flashlight in one hand, his other hand resting tensely on his belt as he moved carefully through the dense, dark forest. His boots sank into the mud with each step, the weight of the night pressing down on his chest. He had received the distress call barely 20 minutes ago. A couple lost deep in the woods, their voices frantic and desperate over the phone before the call abruptly cut out. He should have waited for backup. That would have been the protocol. But something about the tremble in the woman's voice, the sheer panic laced in her words, had propelled him forward. The searchlight cut through the darkness, illuminating the towering trees around him. But the wind howled, and the storm swallowed most of the sounds around him. Then, just as he was about to call out, he heard it. A weak, trembling voice. "Help! Please! We're here!" Daniel's pulse quickened. He moved faster, pushing past the branches until he stumbled upon them. A man and a woman, both soaked to the bone, their clothes torn as if they had been running through the underbrush for hours. The woman clung to the man, shivering violently, her dark hair plastered against her pale face. The man, slightly older, was breathing heavily, his arm wrapped tightly around his wife as if shielding her from something unseen. Daniel knelt beside them, scanning them quickly. "I'm Officer Carter. Are you hurt? What happened?" The woman looked up at him with wide, terrified eyes, her lips trembling as she tried to form words. We can't be here. They're looking for us," she whispered. "Please, you have to get us out of here before they find us." Daniel frowned, glancing around the empty forest. "Who's looking for you?" The man coughed, wincing in pain as he shifted slightly. That was when Daniel noticed it. The small silver pendant clutched tightly in his fist. The chain was tangled around his fingers, as if he had been gripping it for dear life. "This?" the man gasped, lifting his shaking hand slightly. "They can't find this." Daniel's gaze dropped to the pendant, his instincts immediately on high alert. It wasn't just any piece of jewelry. It was old, worn with time, and engraved with something barely visible under the dirt and rain. A single address: McDonald's, Central Avenue, 57. A strange feeling settled in Daniel's chest, a cold unease creeping up his spine. He didn't know why, but something about that address rang a distant bell in his memory. He shook it off and focused on the immediate problem. "We need to get you out of here first," he said, helping the woman to her feet. "Can you walk?" She nodded weakly, though her hands trembled as she gripped Daniel's arm for support. The man struggled to stand, but Daniel caught him, throwing one of the man's arms over his shoulder. "Just hold on. I've got you." As they made their way back to the patrol car, Daniel kept his senses sharp. The woman kept looking over her shoulder, as if expecting something or someone to emerge from the darkness. The moment they reached the car, Daniel quickly secured them inside, then reached for his radio. "Dispatch, this is Carter. I have 2 civilians in need of medical attention. Possible trauma, possible pursuit. Requesting immediate assistance." The static crackled for a second before the response came. "Copy that, Officer Carter. Ambulance en route. ETA 15 minutes. 15 minutes. That was all they needed. He turned back to the couple, but before he could say anything else, the woman grabbed his wrist. Her fingers were ice cold. "Officer, you don't understand," she whispered, eyes wide with something deeper than fear. "You need to destroy that pendant. If they know you have it, you'll never be safe again." A crack of thunder rolled through the sky, shaking the ground beneath them, and in that single moment, Daniel felt it, the shift in his reality. Whatever he had just stumbled upon was bigger than him, bigger than a simple rescue, and something told him that this night was just the beginning. Daniel sat in his patrol car, watching the rain streak down the windshield in heavy, erratic trails. The couple had been taken to the hospital nearly an hour ago, and yet, he couldn't bring himself to start the engine. His fingers tapped against the steering wheel as his mind replayed every detail of the night over and over again. The forest, the fear in their eyes, the pendant, that address, McDonald's, Central Avenue, 57. It gnawed at him, a whisper at the back of his mind, urging him to look deeper. He told himself it was nothing, just another case, another strange, frantic night in a job full of them. And yet, when he finally put the car in gear, he didn't drive home. He drove toward that address. The streets were slick with rain, the neon lights reflecting off the pavement as he navigated through the quiet city. The McDonald's wasn't far. He knew that without even needing to check the GPS. It was a spot he'd driven past 1,000 times, an unremarkable fast food joint sandwiched between a gas station and a strip mall. Nothing about it should have stood out, but tonight it did. It loomed in the darkness, its golden arches casting an eerie glow against the wet asphalt. Daniel pulled into the nearly empty parking lot, his stomach tightening as he turned off the engine. What was he expecting to find? A crime scene? A hidden message? Maybe nothing at all. But he had to be sure. He stepped inside, greeted by the artificial brightness and the faint scent of frying oil. A single employee stood behind the counter, a teenage boy who barely looked up from his phone. "Welcome to McDonald's," the kid mumbled. "Can I take your order?" Daniel hesitated, then cleared his throat. "Yeah, just a coffee." The boy nodded, tapping the register lazily. Daniel glanced around. The place was nearly empty, except for an older man sitting alone in a booth near the window, nursing a cup of coffee that had probably gone cold an hour ago. Nothing seemed out of the ordinary, so why did his gut still tell him something was off? His coffee came in a paper cup, steam curling from the opening in slow, ghostly tendrils. He carried it to a corner booth, sat down, and forced himself to take a sip. "Relax, you're chasing shadows." But just as he was about to pull out his phone, something caught his eye. Something small. Something wedged between the napkin dispenser and the salt packets. A folded slip of paper. His heartbeat kicked up as he reached for it. The paper was damp, the ink slightly smudged, but the message was clear. "You need to act fast." Daniel's breath caught in his throat. He looked around, his pulse hammering in his ears. The boy at the counter was still glued to his phone. The old man hadn't moved. The restaurant was still empty. So who had left the note? He turned it over, but there was nothing on the back. No signature, no explanation, just those 4 words. "You need to act fast." His fingers clenched around the paper. Suddenly, the pendant in his pocket felt heavier, like a weight pressing against him. Maybe he should have left it at the station. Maybe he should have listened to the woman's warning. But it was too late for that now. A sharp chime from his phone jolted him from his thoughts. A message. A known number. "They know you have it." His blood ran cold. He stood abruptly, knocking over the coffee, but he didn't care. He scanned the restaurant one last time before striding out into the rain, his heart racing. He needed answers. He needed to know what was happening. But most of all, he needed to protect the people he loved. And that meant getting home fast. When he pulled into his driveway, the house was dark. Too dark. His wife, no ex-wife, usually left the porch light on, even when she was angry at him. His stomach twisted as he killed the engine and stepped out, the rain soaking through his uniform as he approached the front door. He knocked once, twice. No answer. "Emma?" he called. "It's me." Nothing. His pulse thundered in his ears. He reached for the handle and turned it. Unlocked. The door creaked open into a heavy silence. His eyes adjusted to the dimness. The living room was exactly as he had left it that morning. Blankets draped over the couch, His daughter's toys scattered across the floor, but something felt wrong. He moved deeper into the house, his breath shallow. Emma, then he heard it. A soft, muffled sob, coming from down the hall. His chest tightened as he followed the sound to his daughter's bedroom. He pushed open the door slowly, and there, sitting on the edge of the bed, was Emma. Her shoulders shook as she cradled their little girl, Lucy, in her arms. Lucy's breathing was shallow, her tiny hands curled into fists against Emma's chest. Daniel's stomach dropped. What happened? His voice came out rough, strained. Emma didn't look up. She had another episode, she whispered. It's getting worse, Daniel. He swallowed hard. Lucy had always been fragile, her health a constant battle they fought together. But lately, things had taken a turn. The doctors had no answers, no solutions, only more tests, more waiting, more helplessness. Daniel knelt beside them, brushing a damp curl from his daughter's forehead. I'll take her to the hospital. Emma finally looked at him, her eyes red-rimmed and exhausted. And then what? They'll run more tests? Tell us they don't know why she's getting weaker. Her voice cracked. She doesn't have time for that, Daniel. He clenched his jaw, guilt twisting inside him. He had spent the night chasing shadows while his daughter lay here, struggling to breathe. I had a case. Couple in the woods. He stopped himself. What was he supposed to say? That a pendant and a cryptic note had somehow pulled him into something bigger than he could understand? That he had this gnawing feeling that it all meant something? That it might somehow connect to them? Emma shook her head. It doesn't matter. Not right now. She stood, carefully shifting Lucy against her shoulder. We need to go. Daniel exhaled sharply and nodded, pushing everything else aside. Whatever was happening, whatever they knew, could wait. His daughter couldn't. As they drove to the hospital, Emma's hand rested protectively on Lucy's back, and Daniel couldn't shake the feeling that this was just the beginning. That the note, the pendant, the couple in the woods, it was all leading to something. And somehow, some way, it was going to change everything. The hospital waiting room was eerily quiet, save for the low hum of fluorescent lights and the occasional beep from the nurse's station. Daniel sat with his elbows resting on his knees, hands clasped together as he stared at the scuffed tiles beneath his feet. The air smelled of antiseptic and something sterile, something cold. Across from him, Emma cradled Lucy in her arms, rocking her gently as if the motion alone could keep her safe. Lucy had fallen asleep shortly after they arrived, her small body curled against her mother like she knew she belonged nowhere else. But her breathing was still too shallow, her skin too pale. Daniel had seen her like this before, but this time felt different, felt worse. He rubbed his face, exhaustion settling deep into his bones. His mind was a storm. Flashes of the pendant, the couple in the woods, the cryptic note at McDonald's. He wanted to believe they were all separate events, just a string of strange coincidences. But the knot in his stomach told him otherwise. His phone buzzed in his pocket, jolting him from his thoughts. He pulled it out, expecting another unknown number, another ominous message. But it wasn't that. It was his boss. With a sigh, he stood and walked a few feet away before answering. Carter, he said, voice low. You didn't file your report. Chief Reynolds' voice came through the receiver, steady but carrying an edge of impatience. You called in a rescue, 2 civilians found in distress, and then nothing? What the hell is going on? Daniel exhaled slowly. He hadn't even realized how much time had passed. They were taken to the hospital, he said. The woman was scared out of her mind. She kept saying someone was after them. Reynolds was silent for a moment. And you believed her? I don't know what I believe, Daniel admitted, glancing back at Lucy, her tiny form barely rising with each breath. But I know they were running from something. Did they say what? Daniel hesitated. No, he lied. He wasn't ready to explain the pendant, the address, the warning note. He didn't even know what any of it meant yet. Reynolds sighed on the other end. Look, Carter, I get that you like to follow your gut, but you need to be careful. Not every scared couple in the woods is running from some grand conspiracy. Something in Daniel tensed. You think I'm making too much out of this? I think you need to focus on your family, Reynolds said, voice softening slightly. I heard about your daughter. I'm sorry, man. You should be with them, not chasing ghosts. Daniel's grip on the phone tightened. He wanted to believe Reynolds was right, that none of this had anything to do with him. But deep down, he knew better. I'll file the report, he said finally, then hung up before Reynolds could say anything else. He returned to his seat just as a doctor approached them, her expression unreadable. Emma immediately straightened, clutching Lucy closer. Is she okay? She asked, voice tight with worry. The doctor hesitated. We're running tests, but we need to keep her overnight for observation. Her oxygen levels are lower than they should be, and we want to make sure we're not missing anything. Emma nodded, biting her lip, but Daniel saw the fear in her eyes. It wasn't just concern, it was something else. Something she wasn't saying. I'll stay, Emma whispered. You should go home, get some rest. Daniel frowned. I'm not leaving. You haven't slept, Daniel, she said, her voice quiet but firm. Go home. Come back in the morning. He wanted to argue, but deep down he knew she was right. He was running on fumes. And besides, he had something else to do. Something he wasn't ready to say out loud. He leaned down, pressing a kiss to Lucy's forehead, then touched Emma's hand briefly. Call me if anything changes, he said, then forced himself to walk away. By the time he got to his car, the rain had stopped, but the air was thick, heavy with something unspoken. He sat behind the wheel, staring out at the dark city before him. He could go home, try to sleep, pretend none of this was clawing at the back of his mind. Or he could follow the only lead he had. He pulled out his phone and opened the browser. McDonald's, Central Avenue, 57. There had to be something, some connection. His fingers hovered over the keys before he typed in the address. A few seconds later, a search result popped up. He clicked it, and his blood ran cold. There was a news article, an old one, from 13 years ago. The headline read, Infant kidnapped from local hospital. Parents desperate for answers. Daniel's heart pounded as he skimmed the article. A baby girl had been taken from the hospital in the middle of the night. The parents had been devastated, but there were no leads, no witnesses, no sign of forced entry. And the strangest part? The last place the mother had been seen before the baby disappeared was at McDonald's, Central Avenue, 57. His fingers clenched around the phone. He didn't know why, but something inside him whispered that this wasn't just a coincidence. He thought about the pendant, the warning note, the way the woman in the woods had begged him to destroy it. And then the worst thought of all struck him like a punch to the gut. What if this has something to do with Lucy? He shook his head, pushing the thought away. It was impossible. Lucy was his daughter. She had been born at St. Mary's Hospital, 2 months premature. She had spent weeks in the NICU before they had finally taken her home. There was no way she was connected to that article. And yet, the unease in his gut refused to fade. He needed to go back. To the restaurant. He needed to find out why that address kept appearing, why a 13-year-old crime was suddenly tied to his life. He started the car, the engine roaring to life beneath him. As he pulled onto the road, his phone buzzed again. Another message from the unknown number. You're asking the wrong questions. Daniel's grip tightened on the wheel. He didn't know who was watching him, who was pulling these strings. But he was done ignoring it. He was going to get answers, no matter what it took. The drive back to McDonald's felt longer this time, the weight of everything pressing down on Daniel like a storm ready to break. His knuckles were white against the steering wheel, his pulse a steady drum in his ears. The city was quiet at this hour, the streets lined with dim streetlights casting long, eerie shadows. He couldn't shake the feeling that he was being watched, that every turn he took, every stoplight he slowed for, was being observed by someone just out of sight. His mind was racing. The missing infant from 13 years ago, the pendant with the address, the note warning him to act fast, and Lucy, his Lucy, getting sicker by the day with no explanation. He couldn't prove they were all connected, but deep down, something told him they were. When he finally pulled into the parking lot of McDonald's, the neon glow of the golden arches flickered above him, casting an unsettling light against the wet pavement. The restaurant was still open, though barely anyone was inside at this hour. A lone car was parked near the back, its dark windows reflecting the dim streetlights. Daniel scanned the area as he stepped out of his vehicle, every nerve in his body on high alert. He wasn't just here for answers. He was here for the truth. The moment he walked inside, the atmosphere felt different. The same teenage cashier stood behind the register, eyes half-lidded with boredom as he scrolled through his phone. But something about the place felt off. The fluorescent lights above seemed harsher, the air heavier, as if the walls were pressing in around him. The same old man from the night before still sat at the booth near the window, sipping his coffee as if time had frozen for him. Daniel approached the counter, clearing his throat. The kid glanced up, barely interested. "Welcome to McDonald's. Can I take your order?" Daniel leaned in slightly, lowering his voice. "Who left that note here?" The cashier blinked, confused. "What note?" "The one I found last night," Daniel said, watching him closely. "You were here. Someone left a note right where I was sitting." "You didn't see anything?" The kid shrugged. "Man, I just work the register. People come and go." He glanced over Daniel's shoulder at the empty restaurant. "You sure it wasn't like a prank?" Daniel clenched his jaw. He knew what he had seen, what he had found, but pressing the kid further wouldn't get him anywhere. He exhaled sharply. "Fine, just a black coffee." The cashier rang up the order, still looking at Daniel like he was some paranoid cop on a bad streak. He disappeared into the back for a moment, and as Daniel waited, his gaze wandered back to the old man in the booth. The guy hadn't moved an inch, hadn't even looked at him, but something about him felt wrong. Daniel grabbed his coffee and made his way to the same corner booth as the night before. He sat, taking slow sips, pretending to be lost in thought. But in reality, he was watching, waiting. If someone had left him a message before, maybe they'd do it again. The minutes dragged on. The restaurant remained empty, save for the three of them: the bored cashier, the silent old man, and himself. Daniel's eyes flickered down to the table, searching for anything. Any slip of paper, any clue. Nothing. Then, just as he was about to leave, the old man moved. It was subtle, just the faintest shift in his posture, the slow lowering of his coffee cup. But then, for the first time, he turned his head and looked directly at Daniel. A chill ran down Daniel's spine. The man's eyes were piercing, dark and knowing, like he had been expecting this moment, like he had been waiting for Daniel to return. "You shouldn't have come back," the old man said, his voice gravelly, like it had been worn down by years of secrets. Daniel set his coffee down. "Then tell me why I should leave." The man studied him for a long moment, then leaned in slightly. "Some questions are better left unanswered, Officer Carter." Daniel narrowed his eyes. "You know my name." The old man gave a slow, almost imperceptible nod. "I know a lot of things." "Like what?" Daniel pressed. "What happened 13 years ago? What this pendant means?" He pulled it from his pocket, setting it down on the table between them. The old man's expression didn't change, but Daniel swore he saw something flicker behind his eyes. "Recognition. You should have left that where you found it," the man murmured. Daniel's patience snapped. "Enough with the cryptic warnings. I need answers. My daughter is sick. And I think whatever this is, whatever happened all those years ago, it's connected to her." For the first time, the old man looked sad. His gaze dropped to the pendant, and when he spoke again, his voice was quieter. "Do you know what happens when you dig too deep into something you were never meant to find?" Daniel's jaw tightened. "I find the truth." The man exhaled, slow and tired. He looked around the restaurant, as if checking for unseen eyes, then finally leaned in further. 13 years ago, a baby was taken from St. Mary's Hospital, he said. No forced entry, no witnesses, just gone. Daniel's pulse pounded. "I know. I read the article." But what the article didn't say, the man continued, is that 2 nights before she disappeared, her mother went to a McDonald's on Central Avenue. This McDonald's, she was meeting someone who promised her answers about her daughter's condition. Daniel's breath caught. Condition? The man nodded. The baby had a rare disorder, something the doctors couldn't explain. She would have episodes, sudden drops in oxygen levels, organ stress, just like your daughter. A cold weight settled in Daniel's stomach. What are you saying? The old man studied him carefully. I'm saying you're not asking the right question, Officer Carter. You shouldn't be asking where that baby went. His voice dropped lower. You should be asking who she became. Daniel's mind reeled. He felt like the ground had been ripped out from under him. Like every breath he took suddenly felt heavier. No, it's not possible. Can't be. The old man pushed something across the table. A folded piece of paper, much like the one Daniel had found before. Take this, he said. But once you read it, there's no going back. Daniel hesitated, then picked it up with slightly unsteady fingers. He unfolded it, scanning the message scrawled inside. You already know the answer. A rush of air left his lungs. His hands clenched around the paper as he looked back up, ready to demand more. But the old man was gone. Daniel whipped his head around, scanning the restaurant. Nothing. The door hadn't even opened. It was as if he had vanished into thin air. His heart pounded. He had come looking for answers, and now he had the one answer he never wanted to hear. Because deep down, in the place he never wanted to acknowledge, he already knew the truth. Lucy wasn't his daughter. Daniel sat in his car, gripping the steering wheel so tightly that his knuckles turned white. The paper with the old man's message lay open on the passenger seat, taunting him. You already know the answer. His mind was a storm, memories crashing into each other in a frantic search for something, anything, that would prove this wrong. But the more he thought about it, the more the pieces started falling into place. Lucy's unexplained episodes. The way no doctor had ever been able to pinpoint what was happening to her. The fear in Emma's eyes whenever she spoke about their daughter's health. And now, the missing infant from 13 years ago. A baby with the same mysterious condition. A mother who had gone to McDonald's, this McDonald's, just before her child disappeared. No, couldn't be. Lucy was his daughter. She had to be. But deep down, in a place he didn't want to acknowledge, doubt had already started to take root. He didn't want to believe it, but he had to know the truth. His fingers trembled as he reached for his phone. He scrolled through his contacts until he found the number he hadn't called in years. Dr. Evelyn Monroe. She had been the lead doctor when Lucy was first born, one of the only ones who had been honest with them about how serious her condition was. If anyone knew something, it was her. He hesitated for only a second before pressing the call button. The phone rang once, twice. Then, a groggy voice answered. Dr. Monroe speaking. Daniel exhaled. Doctor, it's Daniel Carter. There was a pause. Daniel? It's been years. I know. I need your help. He ran a hand through his hair, his heartbeat thundering in his ears. It's about Lucy. That got her attention. He heard her shift, her voice suddenly more awake. Is she okay? She's worse, he admitted. They still don't know what's wrong with her. And He hesitated, the words thick in his throat. I need to ask you something. Something that might sound insane. A long silence stretched between them. Go on, she said finally. When Lucy was born, Daniel began carefully. Was there anything at all, that seemed off? Something you didn't tell us? Another pause. He could hear her breathing on the other end, but she wasn't speaking. Doctor, I can't talk about this over the phone, she said suddenly, her voice low. Meet me at my office. Now. Daniel's stomach twisted. It's 2 a.m. I don't care, she said. If you're asking me this, then you already know something. And that means we don't have time. Come now. The line went dead. Daniel stared at his phone for a second before shoving it into his pocket and starting the engine. Dr. Monroe's office was in a quiet part of the city, nestled between other small medical practices. The building was dark when he arrived, save for a single light shining from her window. He locked his car and made his way inside, his footsteps echoing in the empty hallway. When he reached her office door, it was already open. She stood by her desk, arms crossed, her expression unreadable. She had aged since he had last seen her, her once dark hair streaked with gray, but her sharp, intelligent eyes hadn't changed. "You really want to do this?" she asked, skipping the pleasantries. Daniel nodded, stepping inside. "Tell me the truth. Was Lucy really—" He swallowed hard. "Was she really ours?" Dr. Monroe exhaled and gestured to the chair across from her desk. "Sit." He did. She leaned against the desk, her fingers drumming lightly against the surface. "I knew this day would come eventually," she murmured. Daniel's stomach clenched. "What are you talking about?" She looked him in the eye. "Lucy was never supposed to be yours." The air left his lungs. "What?" She sighed, pinching the bridge of her nose. "I don't know everything, Daniel, but I know enough. 13 years ago, there was a baby girl, a premature infant with an unexplained medical condition. Her mother was desperate for answers. She met with someone who promised to help her, but 2 days later, the baby was gone." Daniel's mouth was dry, and Dr. Monroe hesitated. 5 months later, Emma gave birth to Lucy. He shook his head. "What does that have to do with anything?" Her expression softened, as if she were about to deliver the final blow. "Daniel, Lucy wasn't born 5 months later. She was already alive. Someone powerful changed the records, and they placed her in your family." He felt like the ground had disappeared beneath him. "That's not possible." "It is," she said quietly. "And I think Emma knew." Daniel stared at her, his breath shallow. "No," he said, shaking his head. "Emma wouldn't lie to me about something like this. She wouldn't." Dr. Monroe held his gaze. "Are you sure?" His heart pounded. He thought of the way Emma always avoided talking about Lucy's early days. The fear in her eyes whenever he questioned the doctors. The way she had begged him to stop digging into this. She knew. She had always known. Daniel shot to his feet, his chair scraping against the floor. "I have to go." Dr. Monroe didn't stop him. She just watched, something almost sad in her expression. "Be careful, Daniel," she said as he reached the door. "Whatever this is, it's bigger than you think." But he wasn't listening anymore. He was already out the door, already racing to his car, already dialing Emma's number with shaking hands. She picked up on the second ring. "Daniel." His grip tightened on the phone. "We need to talk. Now." Silence. Then, her quiet voice. "You found out, didn't you?" His heart pounded. "Meet me at home." Emma exhaled shakily. "I'll be there." Daniel ended the call and slammed his foot on the gas. By the time he pulled into his driveway, Emma was already waiting on the porch, her arms wrapped around herself as she watched him get out of the car. He strode up the steps, his pulse hammering. "You knew," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. Emma swallowed, tears brimming in her eyes. "I wanted to tell you, Daniel. I did. But I was scared." "Scared of what?" he demanded. "That I'd find out our daughter isn't really ours?" Emma flinched but held his gaze. "No," she whispered. "Scared of what would happen if the people who did this found out we knew." Daniel's breath hitched. He stared at her, the weight of her words sinking in. This wasn't just a mistake. This wasn't just a mix-up. Someone had taken Lucy. Someone had hidden her. And someone had put her in their family on purpose. "Who are they?" he asked. Emma wiped at her eyes. "I don't know," she said, her voice trembling. "But I do know one thing." Daniel waited, his heart in his throat. "They're still watching us." The world felt like it had shifted beneath Daniel's feet. He stood frozen on the porch, his breath coming in sharp, uneven bursts as Emma's words echoed in his mind. "They're still watching us." His gaze flickered around the darkened neighborhood, scanning the shadows between the houses, the parked cars along the curb. Every silhouette, every flickering porch light, felt like a set of unseen eyes staring back at him. Emma stood just a few feet away, her arms wrapped tightly around herself, shoulders trembling under the weight of what she had just confessed. Her face was pale, her lips pressed into a thin line as she waited for him to speak. But Daniel didn't know what to say. There were too many questions, too many thoughts colliding in his head all at once. "How long?" he finally asked, his voice raw. Emma swallowed hard. "Since the beginning," she whispered. Daniel's jaw clenched. "You mean to tell me that all these years, every single day of Lucy's life, you knew? You knew she wasn't ours, and you never said a word?" Tears welled in Emma's eyes, but she didn't look away. "I didn't have a choice, Daniel," she said, her voice breaking. "I was trying to protect her, to protect us." He let out a bitter laugh, running a hand through his hair. "Protect us from who? Emma? Who did this? Who took her?" Emma hesitated, then shook her head. "I don't know," she admitted. "I swear I don't. All I know is that when I found out the truth, I was told that if I ever tried to dig deeper, if I ever told you, they would take her away again." Daniel's chest tightened. "Who told you that?" Emma wiped at her eyes, her hands shaking. "A man," she whispered. "Years ago. I don't know his name, but he showed up at the hospital when Lucy was barely a year old. He knew everything. About me, about you, about her. He told me that we had to raise her as our own, that if we kept our heads down, no one would get hurt." Daniel stared at her, his mind spinning. "And you just accepted that?" Emma let out a shaky breath. "What was I supposed to do?" she whispered. "Say no? Let them take her back?" "I couldn't." Daniel turned away, gripping the porch railing so hard his fingers ached. His breath was coming too fast, his heart slamming against his ribs. "You should have told me," he muttered. "I had a right to know. I was scared, Daniel." Emma cried. "I still am. Do you think I wanted this? Do you think I don't lie awake every night terrified that someone is going to come take her from us? You're not the only one who loves her." Daniel squeezed his eyes shut. He wanted to be angry. He was angry, but more than that, he was afraid. Because if Emma was telling the truth, if there really were people out there who had orchestrated this, who had been watching them for over a decade, then this was so much bigger than he had ever imagined. He turned back to her, his voice lower now, more controlled. "You said they've been watching us. How do you know?" Emma exhaled shakily. "Because every time I've tried to ask questions, every time I even thought about looking into Lucy's past, something happened." Daniel frowned. "What do you mean?" Emma took a slow breath. 3 years ago, I tried to hire a private investigator. I didn't tell anyone. I didn't even tell you. But the day after our first meeting, his office was cleaned out. Completely empty, like he had never even existed. A cold chill ran down Daniel's spine. Emma went on, her voice quieter now. "A few months later, I got a letter in the mail. No return address, no signature, just one sentence. Stop digging, or you'll regret it." Daniel clenched his jaw. "And you still kept quiet?" Emma shook her head. "What else was I supposed to do?" she whispered. "If they were willing to erase an entire person just to keep this secret, what do you think they'd do if they knew I told you the truth?" Daniel took a slow step back, his mind reeling. This was bigger than a missing child, bigger than just a cover-up. This was something else, something powerful, and now he had stepped straight into it. A sudden noise made them both jump. Car door slamming shut. Daniel's head snapped toward the street. A dark sedan sat parked just a few houses down, its headlights off. His pulse spiked. "Get inside," he ordered. Emma hesitated. "Daniel, now." She didn't argue this time. She scooped Lucy up from her carrier on the porch and disappeared into the house. Daniel waited until she was safely inside before stepping off the porch, moving toward the car with slow, careful steps. But before he could get close, the engine roared to life. The car peeled away from the curb, tires screeching against the pavement as it disappeared down the street. Daniel stood frozen, his fists clenched at his sides. They weren't just being watched. They had been warned. He turned back to the house, his thoughts racing. He needed to figure out what was happening, who these people were, and most importantly, what they wanted with Lucy. Because one thing was clear now, whoever had done this hadn't forgotten about them. And they were just waiting for the right moment to strike. Daniel barely slept that night. He lay in bed staring at the ceiling, his mind caught in an endless loop of questions, possibilities, and fears. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw the dark sedan sitting on the curb, its presence a silent warning that no matter how much he uncovered, he wasn't in control. They were, whoever they were. He had spent his career trusting in logic, in the certainty of facts, but this was something else, something deeper, something he wasn't trained to understand. And the worst part was he didn't even know where to start. Beside him, Emma stirred but didn't wake. He could hear the quiet rhythm of Lucy's breathing through the baby monitor on the nightstand. It should have been comforting. Instead, it sent another wave of fear through his chest. Because if Emma was right, if Lucy had been placed in their family for a reason, then she was in danger. They all were. By the time the sun started creeping over the horizon, Daniel had made his decision. He needed answers. Real ones. Not whispered warnings from old men in diners. Not vague threats from faceless enemies. He needed proof. And there was only one place to get it. St. Mary's Hospital. The records had been altered. The birth certificates had been changed. But somewhere, in some file, in some database, the truth still existed. It had to. Daniel slipped out of bed, moving quietly so he wouldn't wake Emma. He dressed quickly, grabbed his keys, and hesitated for only a second before pulling his gun from the lockbox under his nightstand. He wasn't planning on using it, but after everything that had happened, he wasn't going anywhere unprepared. He scribbled a note for Emma, leaving it on the kitchen counter. Gone to St. Mary's. Stay inside. Lock the doors. Then, without another glance back, he walked out the door. St. Mary's was a 15-minute drive from their house, but this morning it felt longer. The roads were quiet, the city still waking up. He kept checking his rearview mirror, half expecting to see that same dark sedan tailing him, but there was nothing. Still, the paranoia sat heavy in his chest. He knew better than to think he was alone in this. By the time he pulled into the hospital parking lot, the tension in his shoulders had settled into something solid. He had no idea what he was about to walk into. He only knew that once he crossed through those doors, there was no turning back. He stepped inside, the smell of antiseptic and stale coffee hitting him immediately. The place was busier than he expected for this early in the morning. Nurses moving between stations, doctors hunched over clipboards, patients waiting for their names to be called. Daniel made his way toward the front desk, flashing his badge. "I need access to medical records." The receptionist, a tired-looking woman in her 40s, barely glanced at him. "And I need a vacation," she muttered, tapping at her keyboard. "What's the case number?" Daniel hesitated. "It's not an active case." That made her look up. "Then what is it?" He forced himself to stay calm. "I need to see a birth record from 13 years ago. It's important." The woman frowned. "You realize that's not something I can just give you, right?" Daniel leaned in slightly, lowering his voice. "Listen, I'm not asking for a favor. I'm asking because I believe there's been a mistake. One that put a child's life in danger." He held her gaze. "I need to see the file. Please." She hesitated, glancing around. Then, with a sigh, she gestured for him to follow. "Come with me." He followed her down a hallway to a small office in the back. She motioned for him to wait as she sat at a computer, typing something into the system. "What's the name?" Daniel's pulse pounded. "Lucy Carter." She typed it in, frowning at the screen. "You said 13 years ago?" "Yeah." She shook her head. "That's not possible." Daniel's stomach tightened. "Why not?" She turned the monitor slightly so he could see. "Because according to our system, Lucy Carter wasn't born at St. Mary's." A chill ran down his spine. "That's not right," he said, his voice flat. "She was born here." The receptionist shrugged. "Not according to our records." Daniel gritted his teeth. "Try a different name. Try..." He hesitated, then took a breath. "Try Evelyn Monroe." The woman typed in the name, and this time, something popped up. She scanned the screen, her expression shifting. Dr. Monroe was listed as the attending physician on a birth that night, she said slowly. But the file is restricted. Daniel's fists clenched. Restricted by who? The woman shook her head. It doesn't say. Just that access was revoked 10 years ago. Daniel's pulse hammered. 10 years ago. That was when Lucy started getting sick. When Emma had first started acting nervous. It wasn't a coincidence. Couldn't be. He looked at the receptionist. Is there anyone who still has access? She hesitated. Maybe Dr. Monroe herself. But if you're looking for answers, you won't find them here. Daniel exhaled sharply. He needed to talk to Monroe again. A sudden noise made them both jump. The sound of footsteps. Heavy, deliberate, coming down the hallway toward them. Daniel tensed. The receptionist's eyes widened, and she quickly exited out of the system. You need to go, she whispered. Daniel's heart pounded. He turned toward the door, and just as he stepped out, 2 men in dark suits were walking toward him. He didn't stop to think. He turned and walked the other way, keeping his pace steady, controlled. Not too fast, not too slow. He didn't need to look back to know they were following him. He reached the main lobby, pushing through the doors just as his phone buzzed. He pulled it out, his fingers slick with sweat. Unknown number. You were warned. Daniel's breath caught. He jumped into his car, his hands shaking as he fumbled with the keys. He started the engine, pulling out of the lot just as the 2 men stepped outside. They didn't chase him. They didn't need to, because the message was clear. They had let him leave, which meant they weren't afraid of him. They were waiting for him to realize that no matter how hard he fought, no matter how many questions he asked, he would never be the one in control. And worst of all, they were right. Daniel drove in silence, his fingers gripping the wheel so tightly that his knuckles had turned white. His mind was a blur of fragmented thoughts, flashing images, and questions that had no answers. The message on his phone burned in his mind. You were warned. The men in suits, the missing records, the fact that someone, somewhere, had deliberately erased Lucy's birth from St. Mary's Hospital records. He wasn't just uncovering a mistake. He was walking straight into something much bigger than he had ever imagined. The city lights blurred past him as he drove, each street lamp casting fleeting shadows against his windshield. He didn't know where he was going. He just needed to move, needed to think. Every instinct in his body screamed at him that he had to keep his family safe. But how could he do that when he didn't even know who he was up against? His phone rang, cutting through the oppressive silence of the car. Emma. He hesitated before answering. Yeah. Where are you? Her voice was tight with worry. I had to check something. Daniel. Her breath was shaky. I don't know what's going on, but something isn't right. Lucy's been sleeping all day. I can barely wake her up. A cold weight settled in his stomach. What do you mean you can't wake her up? I mean, she opens her eyes for a second, but then she's so weak. Daniel. Worse than before. Emma's voice broke. I think she needs to go back to the hospital. Daniel's grip on the wheel tightened. St. Mary's wasn't an option. Not now. Not when he had just barely walked out of there without getting dragged into some unknown force's grip. But Lucy, she needed help. And fast. Give me 20 minutes, he said. I'll be there. Hurry, Emma whispered. Daniel hung up and pressed the gas pedal harder. He didn't know what was happening to Lucy, but every part of him screamed that it was connected to this, to all of it. When he pulled into the driveway, Emma was already standing on the porch, her arms wrapped around herself as she watched him get out of the car. He could see the panic in her eyes, the way her body trembled slightly in the cold night air. He barely made it inside before she grabbed his arm. Something's wrong, she whispered. Daniel didn't stop to answer. He rushed toward Lucy's bedroom, his pulse hammering. She lay in her bed, curled under the blankets, her small body barely moving with each shallow breath. Her skin looked even paler now, her lips tinged with a faint shade of blue. Daniel knelt beside her, brushing her hair away from her face. Lucy, sweetheart, he said softly. Can you hear me? Her eyelids fluttered, but she barely managed to open them. Emma stood in the doorway, her hands pressed against her mouth. She won't eat, won't drink. It's like something's draining her. Daniel clenched his jaw. This wasn't just an illness. Couldn't be. He turned back to Emma. We can't take her to St. Mary's. Her face twisted with confusion. Why not? That's where her doctors are. They're part of this, Emma. Daniel cut in. The hospital, the records, everything. Someone erased Lucy's past. And I don't know why yet, but I'm not walking back into their hands. Emma's breath hitched. Then what do we do? Daniel hesitated. He had no plan, no answers, but he knew one thing. He wasn't losing Lucy. Then his phone buzzed again. Another unknown number. Another message. You're running out of time. Daniel's pulse pounded. He turned the phone toward Emma, showing her the message. She read it, her face paling even further. Then, a second message came through. A child like her doesn't belong to you. Emma gasped, covering her mouth. Daniel felt his stomach twist into knots. This wasn't just a threat. This was a claim. Someone was telling them that Lucy wasn't theirs to keep. His blood boiled. His fear hardened into something else. Something cold and sharp. Pack a bag, he told Emma. We're leaving. She blinked. What? Where? Somewhere they won't find us, he said, already moving. We need time. Time to figure out what's happening. Emma hesitated for only a moment before nodding and rushing to grab whatever she could. Daniel scooped Lucy into his arms, her body frighteningly light. She stirred slightly, a weak sound escaping her lips. Daddy? She mumbled. Daniel swallowed hard. I've got you, baby. I've got you. But even as he held her, a dark thought slithered into his mind. What if he was already too late? They drove through the night, putting as much distance between themselves and their home as possible. Daniel took back roads, switching routes multiple times, his paranoia making him check every mirror, every car that seemed to follow them for too long. Lucy slept in the back seat, her tiny frame curled under a blanket. Emma sat beside her, her fingers running through their daughter's hair as silent tears streamed down her face. Daniel knew what she was thinking. Was this the last time they'd be together like this? He shook the thought away. He wouldn't let that happen. After nearly 3 hours of driving, they pulled into a small roadside motel. It was barely a speck on the map, the kind of place where no one asked questions. Perfect. Daniel checked them in under a fake name, paid in cash, and led them inside. The room was small, the air stale, but it was safe. For now. Emma sat on the bed, holding Lucy against her chest. What now? She whispered. Daniel stared at them, his chest tightening. I find out who's doing this, he said. And I end it. Emma exhaled shakily. How? Daniel didn't know. Not yet. But as he sat in the dim motel room, listening to the hum of the heater, he knew one thing for certain. He was done being afraid. Whoever had done this, whoever had stolen Lucy, erased her past and watched them for over a decade, thought they could scare him into submission. They were wrong, because he was about to show them that they had picked the wrong man to steal from. And he wasn't stopping until he got his daughter back. For good. The motel room was quiet, save for the distant hum of cars passing on the highway. The air inside was thick, stale, carrying the scent of cheap detergent and old carpets. Daniel sat in the wooden chair near the window, staring at the darkness outside. His fingers drummed against his knee, his mind racing with possibilities. He had always thought he was good at reading situations, at knowing when something wasn't right. But this was beyond anything he had ever faced. Lucy lay curled up on the bed, her breathing slow, her skin still far too pale. Emma sat beside her, smoothing her damp hair away from her forehead, whispering soft reassurances even though Lucy was barely awake enough to hear them. Daniel knew Emma was terrified, knew that deep down she was barely holding it together. He had spent years watching her hide her fear behind determination, behind anger, behind anything that made her feel like she still had control. But now there was nothing left to hide behind. He glanced down at his phone. The unknown number hadn't sent another message. Not yet, but Daniel knew they were watching, knew they were waiting for him to make a move, and he had no choice but to make one. His thoughts were interrupted by a quiet knock at the door. Daniel was on his feet instantly, his gun already in his hand before he even realized he had reached for it. Emma tensed, clutching Lucy closer. Their eyes met, and she gave a small nod. He moved to the door slowly, pressing himself against the wall as he peered through the peephole. Nothing, just the dimly lit motel walkway. He hesitated for only a second before unlocking the door and cracking it open. A folded piece of paper sat on the ground. Daniel's stomach twisted. He glanced around the parking lot, scanning for movement, for shadows, for anything. But there was nothing. No footsteps retreating, no engine revving, just silence. He reached down, snatching the paper off the ground, then quickly shut and locked the door behind him. Emma stood now, her arms wrapped protectively around Lucy. "What is it?" she whispered. Daniel didn't answer. He unfolded the paper with steady hands, forcing himself to breathe evenly. One line, written in neat, deliberate handwriting. "You're asking the wrong question." Daniel stared at the words, his pulse hammering. The wrong question. What the hell did that mean? He turned the paper over, looking for anything else, but it was blank. Emma moved closer, reading over his shoulder. "Daniel," her voice was barely above a whisper. What if we're looking at this the wrong way?" He frowned, shaking his head. "What are you talking about?" Emma swallowed hard. "We've been asking who took Lucy, who's watching us, who's trying to take her back." She looked up at him, her expression tight with fear and realization. "But what if that's not the right question?" Daniel exhaled sharply, running a hand down his face. "Then what is?" Emma hesitated. "What if it's not about who did this?" She met his gaze. "What is Lucy?" Silence. Daniel's stomach turned. It was absurd, ridiculous. Lucy was a child, a little girl, their daughter. But as the thought sank deeper, the words on the paper burned into his mind. "You're asking the wrong question." And suddenly, he wasn't so sure anymore. The next morning, Daniel didn't waste time. They needed answers, and there was only one person left who could give them. Dr. Evelyn Monroe. She had known something, had tried to warn him, but she had held back. And Daniel wasn't leaving until he had the truth. Emma stayed at the motel with Lucy, the door locked, the curtains drawn. He made her promise not to open it for anyone. Then he drove, his hands gripping the wheel tighter with every passing mile. St. Mary's was no longer an option. They had made that clear. But Dr. Monroe had a private practice now, a small office on the outskirts of town. If she was involved in this, if she had any more secrets, Daniel was going to find out. He pulled into the parking lot just as the sun was beginning to rise. The building was small, isolated, tucked between a row of overgrown trees. Daniel stepped out of the car, scanning his surroundings. No cars, no movement, no sign of Monroe. His gut twisted. Something wasn't right. He approached the front door and knocked. No answer. He knocked again. Still nothing. Daniel clenched his jaw. He reached for the doorknob. Locked. He glanced around once more before stepping back. Then, with one swift movement, he lifted his foot and kicked the door in. It gave way instantly, the frame splintering. The moment he stepped inside, he knew. The office was empty, completely cleared out. Papers scattered across the floor. Cabinets open. Chairs overturned. Dr. Monroe was gone. Daniel moved deeper into the office, his heart pounding. This wasn't just an abandoned space. This was a message. Someone had been here before him, and they had made sure there was nothing left for him to find. His eyes scanned the room, looking for anything at all, that might have been left behind. And then he saw it. A single piece of paper, pinned to the wall with a thumbtack. He moved closer, his pulse hammering. 2 words. "She's changing." Daniel's breath caught. His stomach twisted into knots. And suddenly, for the first time since this nightmare had started, real, paralyzing fear settled into his bones. He turned, sprinting back toward the car. Lucy. He had to get back to Lucy. Now, the drive back to the motel was a blur. His hands were tight on the wheel, his heart slamming against his ribs. The words echoed in his head. She's changing. What did it mean? What had Monroe been trying to tell him? He pushed the accelerator harder, barely slowing down for traffic. By the time he reached the motel, his chest was so tight it hurt to breathe. He parked crookedly, jumping out of the car before the engine had fully shut off. He ran to the door, pounding on it. Emma! No answer. His heart nearly stopped. Emma! Open the door! Still nothing. His hands shook as he pulled out his key, jamming it into the lock. He pushed the door open so hard it slammed against the wall. Emma was sitting on the bed, her face pale, her eyes locked on Lucy. Daniel froze. Lucy was awake, but she wasn't just awake. She was staring at him. And her eyes weren't Lucy's anymore. They were glowing. A faint, unnatural luminescence, almost imperceptible. But Daniel saw it. His blood ran cold. Lucy blinked slowly, tilting her head. Daddy! Daniel's heart pounded so loudly he could barely hear anything else. He couldn't move, couldn't breathe. He didn't know what was happening. But one thing was certain. His daughter wasn't his daughter anymore. Daniel stood frozen in the doorway, his breath caught in his throat. The air in the room felt thick, suffocating, as if the very walls were pressing in around him. Lucy sat on the bed, her small body barely making an indent in the worn motel mattress, her hands resting limply on her lap. But her eyes, God, her eyes weren't the same. There was something wrong about them. The faintest glow, unnatural and almost imperceptible, flickered behind her pupils like embers struggling to stay lit. It wasn't bright enough to be obvious, but Daniel saw it. He felt it, and in that moment, every nerve in his body screamed at him that whatever had been happening to Lucy wasn't just a sickness. It was something else. Emma was still sitting beside her, her hands clasped so tightly in her lap that her knuckles had turned white. She hadn't looked at Daniel yet. She hadn't moved. It was as if she were afraid that if she did, whatever was sitting next to her on that bed wouldn't be their daughter anymore. Daniel forced himself to breathe. Emma, he said carefully, his voice low. What happened? Emma swallowed hard, finally turning to face him. Her eyes were glassy with unshed tears. She woke up like this, she whispered. She's different, Daniel. I don't know how, but she is. Lucy blinked slowly, tilting her head. Mommy! Her voice was quiet, innocent, the same voice he had heard 1,000 times. But something about it made his skin crawl. Emma's breath hitched. I'm here, baby, she murmured, forcing a small smile that didn't reach her eyes. Lucy's gaze flickered toward Daniel, and when she looked at him, something inside of him twisted. It was her. But it wasn't. He took a slow step forward. Hey, sweetheart, he said gently. How are you feeling? Lucy didn't answer right away. She just watched him, studying his face with an intensity that no 6-year-old should have. Then, after a long pause, she whispered, I had a dream. Daniel forced himself to keep his expression neutral. Yeah, Lucy nodded. I saw you in it. His stomach tightened. You did. Lucy's lips pressed together in a thin line. But it wasn't really you. Daniel's breath caught. Emma let out a shaky exhale, gripping the edge of the bed. Lucy, baby, what do you mean? Lucy looked down at her hands. It was different. Everything was different. She glanced back up at Daniel, and this time, something flickered behind her expression. Not fear, not confusion, recognition. You're scared of me, she said softly. Daniel didn't answer. He couldn't, because she was right. Emma shot him a pleading look, silently begging him to say something, to fix whatever was happening. But Daniel didn't know how. His mind was a storm of unanswered questions, of fear, of doubt. Lucy wasn't supposed to be here. Someone had put her in their family. Someone had taken her from wherever she had belonged and placed her in their lives. And now, whatever had been done to her was starting to show. Daniel ran a hand down his face, trying to think. "We need to go," he said suddenly, his voice sharper than he intended. "Now." Emma's eyes widened. "Where?" "Somewhere safe," Daniel said, grabbing his bag. Emma didn't argue. She scooped Lucy into her arms, holding her as if she were afraid she might disappear. "Daniel, I don't know what's happening," he admitted, his hands shaking as he threw their things together. "But we can't stay here. We're not alone in this, Emma. Something is watching. And if we don't move now, we might not get another chance." Emma swallowed hard, nodding. She didn't need convincing. They moved quickly. Daniel carried Lucy out to the car, strapping her into the back seat while Emma slid in beside her. As he climbed into the driver's seat, his phone buzzed. He hesitated before looking down. Another message. Another warning. "This is your last chance to let her go." Daniel's grip tightened around the phone. No more warnings. No more running. Whoever had done this, whoever had stolen Lucy, erased her past and placed her in their lives, thought they had control. But they were wrong, because Daniel wasn't stopping. Not until he had the truth. Not until he knew exactly what had been done to his daughter. And not until he made them pay for it. He put the car in drive and floored it, the tires screeching against the pavement. They weren't running anymore. They were hunting. And he was going to find whoever had done this, even if it was the last thing he ever did.